In the winter of 2003, a mother and her 7-year-old son walked out of their suburban home in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, and were never seen again. No signs of struggle, no ransom demand, no bodies. For 21 years, their disappearance remained one of the region's most baffling cold cases, until a demolition crew, tearing down an abandoned psychiatric hospital 30 miles away, discovered something behind a sealed wall that would rewrite everything investigators thought they knew about that winter morning. This is the story of what they found, and the darkness that had been waiting all those years to be uncovered. If you're drawn to stories of unsolved mysteries and the secrets that refuse to stay buried, stay with us. The Hargrove Institute for Mental Wellness had stood empty for 17 years when the demolition order finally came through. The massive Victorian structure, with its limestone facade and barred windows, had been built in 1892 and abandoned in 2007 when budget cuts and scandals finally shuttered its doors for good. Local teenagers whispered stories about the place, daring each other to climb the rusted fence, though few ever made it past the overgrown courtyard. On a gray morning in March 2024, Marcus Webb stood in the shell of what had once been the hospital's east wing, supervising his crew as they systematically dismantled the building's interior. The work was methodical, careful. Buildings this old sometimes contained asbestos, lead paint, things that required proper handling. It was Tommy Reese, the youngest member of the crew, who first noticed something odd about the wall in the basement corridor. He'd been removing old light fixtures when his pry bar punched through drywall that sounded hollow, wrong somehow. The space behind it should have been solid brick, part of the building's original foundation. Marcus joined him, running his gloved hand across the surface. The wall was newer than the rest of the basement, definitely an addition, made long after the hospital's construction. Without a word, he picked up a sledgehammer and swung it against the drywall. The material crumbled easily, revealing a darkness beyond. Tommy held up his flashlight, the beam cutting through decades of stale air. What the light revealed made him step back sharply, his breath catching in his throat. Marcus moved closer, his own flashlight joining Tommy's. The space was small, perhaps 6 feet by 8 feet, sealed on all sides, and inside, arranged with an almost careful precision, were 2 figures. Even after 21 years, even reduced to bone and dried tissue, it was clear what they were looking at. An adult and a child, sitting against the far wall, as if they had simply decided to rest there and never got up again. Marcus pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed 911. Neither he nor Tommy spoke as they waited, both men unable to look away from the terrible stillness of that hidden room, from the small hand that rested eternally in the larger one beside it. Detective Sarah Chen had been with the Millbrook Police Department for 12 years, but she had never worked the Brennan case. She'd been fresh out of the academy when Catherine Brennan and her son Oliver disappeared, too junior to be involved in the investigation. But like everyone else in town, she remembered. The call came through just after 9 in the morning. Sarah was at her desk, reviewing case files, when Captain Morris appeared in her doorway. His face had the gray, drawn look of someone who'd just seen something that would haunt him. "We've got something at the old Hargrove Institute," he said. "2 bodies. They've been there a long time." The drive to the hospital took 25 minutes. Sarah rode in silence beside Morris, watching the landscape change from suburban streets to the overgrown wilderness that had reclaimed the hospital grounds. Yellow tape already cordoned off the site when they arrived, and 3 patrol cars blocked the main entrance. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Voss, met them at the door. She was a woman in her 60s, with steel gray hair and eyes that had witnessed more death than most people could imagine. "Basement," she said simply. "East wing. You're going to want to prepare yourselves." They followed her down a staircase that groaned under their weight, through corridors where paint peeled from walls and ceiling tiles hung at dangerous angles. The air smelled of mold and decay, of decades of neglect. At the end of a long hallway, portable lights had been set up, illuminating the hole in the wall and the small room beyond. Sarah stopped at the threshold, her trained eye taking in every detail. The bodies sat against the far wall, skeletal hands intertwined. The adult figure wore the remnants of what had once been a blue sweater, now faded to gray. The child, smaller, wore what looked like the tatters of a red jacket. Around them, scattered on the floor, were items that sent a chill through Sarah's chest. A child's coloring book, its pages yellowed and brittle. A woman's purse, the leather cracked and dried. A pair of small sneakers still tied. "Preliminary assessment," Dr. Voss said, her voice clinical but not unkind, "is that they've been here between 15 and 25 years. No obvious signs of trauma to the bones. But I won't know more until we get them to the lab." The space was completely sealed. No airflow, no access. Sarah knelt carefully at the edge of the opening, her flashlight revealing more details. The walls of the hidden room were painted a pale institutional green. There was a bucket in one corner, and beside it, several empty water bottles. Her stomach turned as the implication became clear. Whoever had been placed in this room hadn't been dead when the wall was sealed. "The purse," Sarah said, pointing to the leather bag near the adult skeleton's hip. "Can we check for identification?" Dr. Voss nodded to one of her assistants, who carefully extracted the purse using gloved hands. The leather crumbled slightly at his touch, but the contents remained intact. He removed a wallet, opened it with painstaking care, and pulled out a driver's license sealed in plastic. Even before he turned it toward the light, Sarah knew what they would find. The face staring out from the faded photograph was one she'd seen countless times on missing person posters that had papered the town for years after the disappearance. Catherine Brennan, last seen January 14, 2003. "We need to contact the family," Morris said quietly. "Her husband, David, if he's still in the area." Sarah stood slowly, her knees protesting. "He never left. Lives in the same house they shared. Never gave up looking for them." She thought about David Brennan, a man she'd seen occasionally around town, always with that haunted look of someone carrying an unbearable weight. For 21 years, he'd lived with not knowing, with the possibility that somewhere, somehow, his wife and son might still be alive. Now that hope would be extinguished, replaced by something potentially worse. The knowledge of how they died. "There's something else," Dr. Voss said, her voice careful. She gestured to the wall itself, to the newer drywall and studs that had sealed the room. This wasn't original construction. Someone built this wall specifically to trap them here. This wasn't an accident or a case of them hiding and getting trapped. This was deliberate. The word hung in the damp basement air. Deliberate. Someone had brought Catherine and Oliver Brennan to this abandoned hospital, placed them in this room, and sealed them inside to die. Someone had listened to their screams, their pleas, and done nothing. Someone had committed one of the cruelest murders Sarah had ever encountered. "I want every inch of this building searched," she said, her voice hard. "Every room, every corridor. And I want the original investigation files on my desk, within the hour. Someone is going to answer for this." As the forensics team began their meticulous work, Sarah stepped back into the corridor, pulling out her phone. The call she had to make to David Brennan would be one of the hardest of her career, but it had to be done. After 21 years of questions, he deserved answers, no matter how terrible they might be. David Brennan's house sat on Maple Street, a quiet residential road where children still rode bicycles and neighbors waved to each other over hedges. The house itself was a modest two-story colonial with white siding and black shutters, well-maintained but somehow lifeless, as if the structure itself had been holding its breath for 21 years. Sarah pulled into the driveway just after noon, Captain Morris beside her. Through the front window, she could see movement, a shadow passing behind curtains. Before they could knock, the door opened. David Brennan had aged in the way that profound grief ages a person. He was 58 now, though he looked older. His hair had gone completely gray, and deep lines bracketed his mouth. But his eyes, a startling blue, were sharp and alert. He'd been waiting for this moment, Sarah realized. Perhaps he'd been waiting for 21 years. "Mr. Brennan," she began, but he held up a hand. "You found them." It wasn't a question. "I saw the news about the hospital on television. I knew." They sat in his living room, surrounded by photographs that chronicled a life interrupted. Catherine, beautiful and dark-haired, laughing at the camera. Oliver, gap-toothed and freckled, holding a soccer ball. The three of them together at the beach, at Christmas, at Oliver's 7th birthday party, just weeks before they vanished. Sarah explained what they'd discovered, watching David's face as she spoke. He sat very still, his hands clasped in his lap, knuckles white. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Where in the hospital?" he finally asked. "The basement, East Wing, a room that had been sealed off." David nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd long suspected. "The Hargrove Institute. Catherine worked there, you know, before Oliver was born. She was a nurse in the psychiatric unit." Sarah exchanged a glance with Morris. This was new information, something that hadn't been in the original case file. "For how long?" 3 years, maybe 4. She left when she got pregnant with Oliver. Said she needed a change, something less stressful. She took a position at the clinic downtown instead. David stood and walked to the window, his back to them. She never talked much about her time at Hargrove. Said it was depressing work, that she'd seen things there that stayed with her. "Do you remember any names?" Sarah asked gently. "Patients she might have mentioned? Staff members she was close to?" David turned back to face them, and Sarah saw something flicker in his eyes. Fear, perhaps, or recognition. There was one patient she talked about sometimes, a woman named Lydia Marsh. Catherine said she'd been at Hargrove for decades, that she'd been committed as a young woman and never left. Catherine felt sorry for her, I think. Used to bring her books, spend extra time with her during rounds. Sarah made a note of the name. "Anyone else?" "Dr. Bernard Cross. He was the head psychiatrist back then. Catherine respected him, said he actually cared about the patients, unlike some of the other doctors." David's jaw tightened. "The morning they disappeared, Catherine got a phone call. Early, around 6. I was in the shower, didn't hear it. When I came downstairs, she was getting Oliver dressed. Said she had to go out for a few hours. She looked upset, shaken. I asked her what was wrong, but she just said an old friend needed help." "She didn't say who?" Morris asked. David shook his head. "I assumed it was one of her nursing school friends, someone with a family emergency. It didn't seem unusual at the time. Catherine was always helping people." His voice cracked. "They left at 6:30. She promised they'd be back by lunch. We were going to go to the movies that afternoon. Oliver wanted to see some animated film. I waited and waited. By 3 o'clock, I called the police." Sarah remembered reading the initial missing persons report, the confusion and growing panic In the responding officer's notes, Catherine's car had been found 2 days later in the parking lot of a grocery store 15 miles away. Keys still in the ignition, no signs of struggle. It was as if she and Oliver had simply evaporated. "Mr. Brennan," Sarah said carefully, "in the years since they disappeared, did you ever receive any threats? Strange phone calls? Letters?" "Nothing. It was like they'd been swallowed by the earth. I hired private investigators, put up billboards, offered rewards. No one came forward with credible information. A few people claimed to have seen them in other states, but it always led nowhere." He returned to his chair, suddenly looking exhausted. "I never remarried, never even dated. How could I? They were still out there somewhere, I thought, still waiting for me to find them." The afternoon light slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes in the air. Sarah watched David Brennan, this man who'd been frozen in time by loss, and felt the weight of the question she had to ask. "Is there anyone you can think of who might have wanted to hurt your wife? Anyone from her past, or someone who might have had a grudge against her?" David was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "About 6 months before they disappeared, Catherine started having nightmares. She'd wake up screaming, saying someone was watching her, that she'd seen a face at the window. I thought it was stress, maybe some kind of anxiety disorder. We talked about her seeing a therapist, but she refused, said she knew what was real and what wasn't, that she just needed time." He looked up at Sarah, his blue eyes haunted. "I should have taken it more seriously. I should have protected them." Sarah leaned forward. "Did she ever describe the face she saw? Give you any details?" "She said it was a woman, an old woman with white hair and dark eyes. She said the woman smiled at her, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who knew a terrible secret." David's hands were shaking now. "I told her it was just a dream, that she was safe. I was so wrong." The Hargrove Institute's administrative building had been spared from immediate demolition, designated as a historical structure that required careful documentation before dismantling. Sarah stood in what had once been the records room, surrounded by filing cabinets that stretched from floor to ceiling, their metal surfaces covered in a thick layer of dust. The hospital had closed in 2007, but its records dated back over a century. Patient files, staff rosters, incident reports, all carefully cataloged and abandoned when the state pulled its funding. Sarah had obtained a warrant within hours of leaving David Brennan's house, and now, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the floor, she and Morris systematically searched for any mention of Lydia Marsh. "Found her," Morris called from across the room. He held up a thick manila folder, its edges yellowed with age. "Patient number 3847, Lydia Ann Marsh, admitted October 1959. Sarah crossed to him, pulling on latex gloves before taking the file. The photograph clipped to the inside cover showed a young woman, perhaps 25, with striking features and long dark hair. But it was her eyes that caught Sarah's attention, wide and bright, with something that might have been fear or fury or both. The admission notes were written in precise handwriting. Patient exhibits severe delusional behavior, claims to have witnessed events that did not occur, dangerous to herself and potentially to others, committed by family petition. Diagnosis: paranoid schizophrenia with violent tendencies. Sarah flipped through page after page of treatment notes, medication logs, incident reports. Lydia had been at Hargrove for 48 years before dying there in 2007, just months before the hospital closed. She'd never had a visitor after the first 2 years. Her family had simply abandoned her to the institution. But it was a note from 1998 that made Sarah pause. The handwriting was different from the others, rounder and more feminine. Patient LM became agitated today when discussing her past, insisted again that she had been wrongly committed, that she knew something dangerous about someone powerful. Claims this person arranged her institutionalization to silence her. When pressed for details, patient became non-responsive. Note: patient has shown marked improvement in lucidity over past year. Recommends psychiatric evaluation for possible reassessment of diagnosis. Nurse C. Brennan. Catherine was advocating for her, Sarah said, showing Morris the note. She thought Lydia might have been wrongly committed. Morris leaned over her shoulder, reading. Did anything come of it? Sarah turned to the next page. The response was written 2 weeks later, in sharp, angular handwriting. Nurse Brennan's recommendation. Reviewed and denied. Patient LM remains high risk. No change in treatment plan. Dr. B. Cross. So Catherine tried to help her, and Cross shut it down. Sarah continued reading. There were more notes from Catherine over the following months, each one expressing concern about Lydia's mental state, each one suggesting the patient was more coherent than her diagnosis indicated. Then, in January 1999, Catherine's notes stopped appearing in the file. That's when she left Hargrove, Morris said, when she was pregnant with Oliver. Sarah closed the file, her mind racing. A patient who claimed to know dangerous secrets, a nurse who believed her, a head psychiatrist who denied every appeal, and 4 years later, that nurse and her son disappeared, only to be found sealed in the basement of the very hospital where she'd once worked. We need to find Dr. Bernard Cross, Sarah said, and we need to find out what Lydia Marsh claimed to know. They spent another hour in the records room, pulling files for other staff members who'd worked at Hargrove during Catherine's tenure. The list was surprisingly short. The hospital had operated with a skeleton crew, even in its final decades, plagued by budget cuts and a reputation that made hiring difficult. One name appeared repeatedly in incident reports: Carl Vickers, an orderly who'd worked at Hargrove from 1995 until the closure. Multiple complaints had been filed against him by both patients and staff, allegations of rough handling and verbal abuse. But he'd never been fired, never faced more than written warnings. Think he's still in the area? Morris asked. Sarah photographed the address, listed in Vickers' personnel file with her phone. Only one way to find out. As they prepared to leave, Sarah took one last look at Lydia Marsh's photograph. The woman stared back at her across decades, those bright eyes holding secrets that had died with her. Or perhaps not. Perhaps those secrets had lived on, had reached out from the grave to claim Catherine and Oliver Brennan, 17 years after Lydia's concerns had been dismissed. The sun was setting when they stepped outside, painting the old hospital in shades of orange and red. In that light, the building looked almost alive, its empty windows like watchful eyes. Sarah suppressed a shiver. Somewhere in this structure, Catherine and Oliver had spent their final hours. Somewhere, someone had made the decision to seal them behind a wall and leave them to die in the darkness. And somewhere, that someone was still free, had been free for 21 years, perhaps believing their crime would never be discovered. Sarah felt a cold determination settle in her chest. Whoever had done this had made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated how long buildings could keep secrets, and how eventually all walls come down. Dr. Bernard Cross lived in a pristine Victorian house on the outskirts of Millbrook, the kind of neighborhood where lawns were manicured and everyone knew their neighbors by name. Sarah and Morris arrived just after 8 the following morning, the sun struggling to break through heavy clouds that promised rain. A woman in her 70s answered the door, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun. She had kind eyes and a wary smile. "Can I help you?" Sarah showed her badge. "I'm Detective Chen. This is Captain Morris. We're looking for Dr. Bernard Cross. Is he available?" The woman's expression shifted, something guarded entering her features. "I'm Eleanor Cross, Bernard's wife. May I ask what this is regarding?" "We're investigating a matter related to the Hargrove Institute. We believe your husband may have information that could help us." Eleanor hesitated, her hand tightening on the doorframe. For a moment, Sarah thought she might refuse them entry. Then she stepped back, opening the door wider. "Bernard isn't well. He has advanced dementia. Most days he doesn't remember my name, let alone things that happened decades ago." They followed her through a house that smelled of lavender and old books, into a sunroom where an elderly man sat in a wheelchair, staring out at a garden filled with early spring flowers. Dr. Bernard Cross was 93 now, his once commanding presence reduced to a frail shell. His hands trembled in his lap, and his eyes had the distant look of someone whose mind had traveled far from the present. "Bernard," Eleanor said softly, kneeling beside him, "there are some people here to see you. Police officers." Cross turned his head slowly. His eyes, though clouded, still held a spark of intelligence. "Police?" His voice was thin, reedy. "What have I done?" "You haven't done anything wrong, Dr. Cross," Sarah said, pulling up a chair to sit at his level. "We wanted to ask you about your time at the Hargrove Institute. Do you remember working there?" Something flickered across Cross's face. Fear? Recognition? It was gone so quickly Sarah couldn't be sure. "Hargrove," he murmured. "So many years ago. So many patients. Do you remember a patient named Lydia Marsh?" The change in Cross was immediate and startling. His trembling hands clenched into fists, and his breathing became rapid and shallow. "No," he said sharply. "No, I don't remember. I don't want to remember." Eleanor stood quickly. "I think that's enough. You can see he's becoming agitated." But Sarah pressed on, keeping her voice gentle. "Dr. Cross, Lydia claimed she knew something dangerous. She said someone powerful now had her committed to keep her quiet. Do you know what she was talking about?" Cross's eyes filled with tears. He looked directly at Sarah, and for just a moment, the fog of dementia seemed to lift. She wouldn't stop talking, wouldn't stop accusing. "I had no choice." They said, "I had no choice." "Who said you had no choice?" Morris asked, leaning forward. But the moment was gone. Cross's face went slack again, confusion replacing clarity. "Where's my lunch? Eleanor, when is lunch? No, I'm hungry." Eleanor moved between them and her husband, her posture protective. "You need to leave. Now. Can't you see you're upsetting him?" Sarah stood, pulling a business card from her pocket. "Mrs. Cross, if your husband remembers anything else, please call me. It's important." Eleanor took the card, but didn't look at it. "Bernard hasn't worked in almost 20 years. Whatever happened at that horrible place has nothing to do with us anymore." As they walked back to the car, rain beginning to fall in cold drops, Morris shook his head. That was a dead end. The man can barely remember his own name. "Did you see his face when I mentioned Lydia Marsh?" Sarah said, starting the engine. "He remembered her, and he was terrified." They drove in silence for several minutes, windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm. Sarah's mind was churning, trying to connect pieces that didn't quite fit. A patient who claimed to know secrets, a doctor who denied her appeals for release, a nurse who tried to help and ended up dead. And now, 21 years later, A confession so vague it was worthless. What did he mean? They said I had no choice. Morris wondered aloud. Who's they? Sarah's phone rang before she could answer. The number was unfamiliar, but she picked up anyway. Detective Chen. Detective, this is Eleanor Cross. The woman's voice was hushed, urgent. I'm calling from my bedroom. Bernard is sleeping. There's something you should know. Sarah pulled over to the side of the road, her pulse quickening. I'm listening. Bernard destroyed his records from Hargrove before the hospital closed, brought them home, and burned them in our fireplace. It took him 2 full days. Eleanor's voice cracked. But he kept one file. I don't know why. It's hidden in his study, in a locked drawer of his desk. I've never looked at it, never wanted to know what he felt he needed to keep secret. But after you left, after seeing his reaction, what's in the file, Mrs. Cross? I don't know. But the name on the tab is Lydia Marsh, and there's a key. She paused. I'll leave it under the mat by the back door. Come tonight, after Bernard is asleep. 9 o'clock. I need to know what my husband was part of, Detective. I need to know what he's been carrying all these years. The line went dead. Sarah looked at Morris, seeing her own anticipation reflected in his face. We're going back tonight, she said, and we're going to find out what Bernard Cross was so desperate to hide. The Cross house looked different at night. The warm Victorian charm it had possessed in daylight transformed into something more sinister under the pale glow of streetlights. Sarah and Morris waited in their unmarked car across the street, watching the windows until one by one the lights went out. At exactly 9 o'clock, Sarah's phone vibrated with a single text message. He's asleep. Come now. They approached through the side yard, their footsteps silent on wet grass. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and cold. Sarah found the key exactly where Eleanor had promised, a small brass key tucked under the welcome mat by the back door. Her hand trembled slightly as she inserted it into the lock. Eleanor met them in the kitchen, a finger pressed to her lips. She wore a thick robe and looked older than she had that morning, as if the weight of what she was about to reveal had aged her in hours. Without speaking, she led them down a hallway to a room lined with bookshelves, Dr. Cross's study. The desk was antique oak, its surface covered with framed photographs and medical journals from decades past. Eleanor knelt beside it, producing another key from her robe pocket. She unlocked the bottom drawer and pulled out a single file folder, thicker than Sarah had expected. I've never opened it, Eleanor whispered. After he burned everything else, I asked him why he kept this one. He said it was insurance. I didn't understand what he meant, and he wouldn't explain. She handed the file to Sarah. Whatever is in there, whatever Bernard did, I need to know. I've spent 50 years married to this man, and I realize now I may never have truly known him at all. Sarah carried the file to the desk, spreading it open under the light of a green banker's lamp. Morris stood beside her, and Eleanor hovered in the doorway, as if afraid to come closer. The first document was Lydia Marsh's original admission form from 1959. But clipped to it was a handwritten letter, the paper yellowed and brittle. Sarah read it aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Cross, this is the woman I mentioned. She worked as a secretary for my father before his death and has since become unstable, making wild accusations about business dealings she could not possibly understand. She's threatened to go to the authorities with fabricated evidence. For the sake of my family's reputation, and in memory of the work my father did for this community, I'm asking you to ensure she receives the long-term care she clearly needs. I trust your discretion in this matter. The donation to the hospital's new wing stands as discussed. Richard Aldridge. Aldridge, Morris said. That name sounds familiar. Richard Aldridge, Eleanor said from the doorway, her voice hollow. He was a real estate developer, very wealthy, very influential. He built half of Millbrook in the 1950s and 60s, died in 1987 if I remember correctly. Sarah turned to the next document, a psychiatric evaluation written in Cross's own hand. It painted Lydia as severely delusional, dangerous, in need of permanent institutionalization. But paperclipped to it was another note, this one in different handwriting, shaky and desperate. Dr. Cross, I am not insane. I saw what I saw. Richard Aldridge's father murdered those people and buried them on the construction site of the shopping plaza on Route 7. I have proof, documents showing he knew the land was contaminated but built anyway. I tried to go to the police, and he had me committed instead. Please, you must listen to me. I am not sick. I am being silenced. L.M. Dear God, Eleanor breathed. Sarah continued reading. There were more letters from Lydia, written over the years, each one pleading for someone to investigate her claims. And there were more notes from Cross, documenting his decisions to keep her sedated, to deny her visitors, to dismiss her requests for legal representation. Each note was coldly clinical, devoid of compassion. But it was a photograph near the bottom of the file that made Sarah's blood run cold. It showed 5 men standing in front of the Hargrove Institute, dated 1975. She recognized a younger Bernard Cross. Next to him stood a man, the caption identified as Richard Aldridge. And beside Aldridge was another man, older, with sharp features and cold eyes. The caption read, H. Aldridge, B. Cross, R. Aldridge, C. Vickers, J. Marsh, at groundbreaking ceremony for Hargrove East Wing. J. Marsh, Sarah said. Vickers was there too. And who's J. Marsh? Morris was already pulling out his phone, typing rapidly. After a moment, he looked up, his face grim. James Marsh, Lydia's younger brother. He was an orderly at Hargrove from 1960 to 1995. Died in a car accident in 1990. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a picture so dark, Sarah felt sick. Lydia Marsh had witnessed something terrible, had tried to expose it, and had been silenced by being committed to a psychiatric hospital. Her own brother had worked there, perhaps to watch over her, perhaps to ensure she stayed silent. And when Catherine Brennan had started asking questions, had started believing Lydia's claims. Where's the rest of it? Sarah asked, looking at Eleanor. Your husband said this was insurance. Insurance against what? Eleanor crossed to the desk, her hands shaking, as she reached into the drawer again. She pulled out a smaller envelope, sealed with wax, that had cracked with age. I found this with the file. I've never opened it. Sarah broke the seal carefully. Inside was a single photograph and a typed letter. The photograph showed a construction site, muddy and raw. But it was what protruded from the mud that made her stomach turn. A human hand, pale and lifeless, partially exposed by excavation equipment. The letter was dated 1958. Bernard, enclosed is the evidence you requested. The remains were discovered during foundation work at the Route 7 site. As discussed, we have taken measures to ensure this does not delay construction. The worker who found them has been compensated for his silence, and the remains have been reinterred deeper on the property. The official record will show no discovery was made. Your continued discretion is appreciated and will be rewarded. H. Aldridge, Harold Aldridge, Morris said. Richard's father. He's the one Lydia saw commit murder. Sarah's mind was racing. Catherine must have found Lydia's claims credible. She must have started investigating, and when someone found out, They killed her, Morris finished. They killed her the same way they'd silenced Lydia, by making her disappear. Eleanor sank into a chair, her face ashen. Bernard knew. All these years, he knew what they'd done, and he kept quiet. He kept this file as insurance, Sarah said, in case the Aldridge family ever turned on him. Evidence that could bring them all down. She looked at the old woman with sympathy. Mrs. Cross, your husband was complicit in Lydia Marsh's wrongful imprisonment. He accepted bribes to keep her locked away. But he may not have known about the murders. This file suggests he was afraid of what the Aldridges were capable of. Small comfort, Eleanor whispered. SARS carefully photographed each document, each piece of evidence that had been hidden for decades. Richard Aldridge died in 1987. Do you know if he had any children? Anyone who might have had a reason to protect the family's secrets? Eleanor nodded slowly. A son. Thomas Aldridge. He still lives in Millbrook, runs the family's real estate company, very prominent in local politics, serves on the city council. She looked up at Sarah, realization dawning in her eyes. You think he's involved? Catherine disappeared in 2003, Sarah said, 16 years after Richard died. But if she'd uncovered evidence of what his grandfather had done, evidence that could destroy the family's reputation and potentially expose them to criminal charges, she let the implication hang in the air. Morris was already heading for the door. We need to find out where Thomas Aldridge was on January 14, 2003. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor caught Sarah's arm. Will Bernard be charged, even though he's the way he is now? Sarah looked at the old woman, seeing the pain and shame in her eyes. That's not my decision to make, Mrs. Cross, but he's 93 years old and barely knows his own name. Whatever justice needs to be served, I think time and conscience may have already delivered it. They left through the back door, the file secured in an evidence bag. As they drove away, Sarah looked back at the Victorian house, at the single light burning in an upstairs window, where Eleanor Cross sat alone with the revelation of what her husband had been. We need to move carefully, Morris said. Thomas Aldridge is connected, powerful. We can't just accuse him of murder based on a 66-year-old photograph and some letters. No, Sarah agreed. But we can find Carl Vickers, and we can find out if anyone saw Catherine Brennan near the Route 7 shopping plaza the day she disappeared. If she was investigating the original murders, she might have gone there looking for evidence. The night had grown darker, clouds obscuring the moon. Somewhere in Millbrook, Thomas Aldridge slept peacefully, perhaps believing his family's secrets were safe. But walls were coming down, literally and figuratively, and the dead were finally ready to speak. Carl Vickers lived in a trailer park on the eastern edge of town, where the houses gave way to industrial zones and forgotten lots. Sarah and Morris arrived at 10 the next morning, armed with a warrant to search Vickers' residence and bring him in for questioning. The sky was overcast, threatening more rain. The trailer bearing Vickers' address number was in poor condition, its siding stained and peeling, windows covered with yellowed curtains. An old pickup truck sat in the gravel driveway, its bed filled with scrap metal and plastic containers. Sarah knocked on the aluminum door, the sound hollow and tinny. No answer. She knocked again, louder. Carl Vickers, Millbrook Police. We need to speak with you. Movement inside. The shuffle of feet. The door opened a crack, and a man's face appeared, weathered and suspicious. Carl Vickers was in his late 60s now, but his build was still solid, his eyes sharp. What did you want? Mr. Vickers, I'm Detective Chen. We have some questions about your time working at the Hargrove Institute. Sarah held up the warrant. May we come in? Vickers' expression didn't change, but Sarah saw his grip tighten on the doorframe. Don't have to tell you anything. Been retired 15 years. Whatever happened at that place ain't my problem anymore. We can do this here or at the station, Morris said. Your choice. For a long moment, Vickers just stared at them. Then he stepped back, opening the door wider. Make it quick. The interior of the trailer was cluttered, but surprisingly clean. Vickers cleared newspapers off a worn couch, gesturing for them to sit. He remained standing, arms crossed over his chest. So, what's this about? You worked at Hargrove from 1995 until it closed in 2007, Sarah said. During that time, did you know a nurse named Catherine Brennan? Something flickered in Vickers' eyes. Might have. Lots of nurses worked there over the years. Catherine Brennan and her 7-year-old son disappeared in January 2003. Their bodies were discovered 2 days ago, sealed in a room in the Hargrove basement. Sarah watched his face carefully. They'd been there since they vanished. Someone trapped them in that room and left them to die. Vickers' jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Sarah pressed on. We have evidence that Catherine was investigating claims made by a patient named Lydia Marsh, claims about murders committed by Harold Aldridge in the 1950s. You were photographed with the Aldridge family at a hospital ceremony in 1975. You knew them. Knew of them, Vickers corrected. They donated money to Hargrove, big donors, but I was just an orderly. Didn't socialize with rich people. But you knew Lydia Marsh. You worked in the same facility, where she was a patient for decades. Morris leaned forward. Her brother James also worked at Hargrove. The two of you overlapped for years. James was a good man, Vickers said, his voice softening slightly. He stayed at that job for 35 years, trying to make sure his sister was taken care of. Broke his heart. What happened to her? What did happen to her, Mr. Vickers? Sarah asked gently. Vickers was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was tired, defeated. Lydia wasn't crazy. Not at first. She was sharp, smart. But 48 years in that place, being told you're insane when you're not, being pumped full of drugs that make you foggy and confused. Eventually, she became what they said she was. You believed her claims about Harold Aldridge. Vickers walked to the window, looking out at the gray morning. I was 17 when I started working at Hargrove as a janitor. My first week, James Marsh pulled me aside, told me to watch out for his sister, make sure the other orderlies didn't rough her up. He told me what she'd seen, what she'd tried to report, said the Aldridges had buried more than bodies under that shopping plaza. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. What else did they bury? Evidence. Financial records showing Harold Aldridge had been skimming from city contracts for years, taking bribes, cooking books. Lydia worked as his secretary. She saw everything, copied documents. When she found out about the bodies on the construction site, she tried to go to the authorities with all of it. Vickers turned back to face them. Harold Aldridge called in favors, had her committed before she could talk. Richard Aldridge made sure she stayed locked up, even after his father died. And Thomas Aldridge? Morris asked. Vickers' face hardened. That one's worse than his father and grandfather combined. Cold. Calculating. When Lydia died in 2007, I thought that was the end of it. The secrets died with her. But Catherine Brennan had started asking questions years before that, Sarah said. Vickers nodded slowly. She came to me in late 2002, said she'd been going through old patient files, had found Lydia's letters, asked me if I thought there was any truth to them. I told her to leave it alone. that the Aldridges were dangerous, that people who asked questions about them had a way of disappearing. But she didn't listen. She was a mother, had a little boy. I begged her to drop it, told her it wasn't worth the risk. Vickers' hands clenched into fists. She said if there were bodies buried under that plaza, those people deserved to be properly laid to rest, said their families deserved to know what happened to them. Did she tell you she was going to investigate the site? Not directly, but I saw her in the parking lot of the Route 7 Plaza. In early January 2003, she was in her car, watching the buildings, taking notes. I pulled up next to her, tried one more time to warn her off. His voice cracked. She thanked me for caring, said she had to do what was right. That was the last time I saw her alive. Sarah felt a chill run through her. Did you see anyone else there that day? Anyone watching her? Vickers hesitated, his face pale. There was another car, parked at the far end of the lot. Black sedan, tinted windows. I couldn't see who was inside, but I got the feeling they were watching Catherine just like I was. Why didn't you come forward when she disappeared? Morris asked, though his tone wasn't accusatory. Because I'm a coward, Vickers said bluntly. Because I knew what the Aldridges were capable of, and I didn't want to end up like Lydia, or like Catherine. So I kept my mouth shut, and hated myself for it. He looked directly at Sarah. But I kept something. Insurance, I guess. James Marsh gave it to me before he died, made me promise to keep it safe. He crossed to a cabinet, pulling out a shoebox from the back. Inside, wrapped in plastic, was a thick envelope. Lydia's copies. The documents. She might have Aldridge's financial crimes. James hid them for decades, figured if anything happened to him, someone might need proof. Sarah took the envelope carefully. Mr. Vickers, you're going to need to come to the station and make a formal statement. Everything you've told us. Vickers nodded. I know, and I will. But there's something else you need to know. He paused, gathering his courage. The day Catherine Brennan disappeared, I got a call at the hospital. Anonymous. Man's voice. Said if I valued my life, I'd forget I ever saw her at that plaza. Said accidents happen to people who can't keep their mouths shut. He looked between Sarah and Morris. The voice belonged to someone educated, refined, someone used to giving orders and having them followed. Thomas Aldridge, Sarah said. I can't prove it, but yes, I believe it was him. Thomas Aldridge's office occupied the top floor of the Aldridge Tower, a sleek glass building that dominated Millbrook's modest skyline. Sarah and Morris arrived with 2 uniformed officers and a warrant for Aldridge's arrest. The evidence from Vickers and Cross, compiled into a case file that had taken them 72 sleepless hours to build. The receptionist, a young woman with perfect makeup and a practiced smile, tried to block their way. Mr. Aldridge is in a meeting. He can't be disturbed. Sarah walked past her without slowing. He'll want to take this meeting. The office was exactly what Sarah had expected. Expensive furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the town, walls lined with photographs of Aldridge, shaking hands with politicians and celebrities. Thomas Aldridge himself sat behind a massive mahogany desk on the phone. He was 62, silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly salary. When he saw them enter, his expression barely changed. He held up one finger, as if asking them to wait while he finished his call. Sarah walked directly to his desk and placed the warrant in front of him. We're done waiting, Mr. Aldridge. Hang up the phone. Something flickered in his eyes. Calculation, perhaps? He ended the call and set the phone down carefully. Detective Chen, isn't it? We met at the mayor's fundraiser last year. I assume this is about that unfortunate discovery at the old hospital. Thomas Aldridge, you're under arrest for the murders of Catherine Brennan and Oliver Brennan. Sarah began reading him his rights. As Morris moved around the desk, handcuffs ready, Aldridge laughed, a cold sound without humor. That's absurd. I barely knew the woman. She worked at a hospital my family donated to. Oh, nothing more. She discovered what your grandfather did. The people he murdered and buried under the Route 7 shopping plaza. The financial crimes he committed. Sarah opened her file, spreading photographs across his desk. She found Lydia Marsh's evidence, the documents proving your family built their fortune on murder and corruption. Aldridge's composure cracked just slightly. That's ancient history. My grandfather died almost 40 years ago. Whatever he may have done has nothing to do with me. Except Catherine was going to expose it all, was going to prove that your family's entire legacy was built on blood and lies. So you had her killed. Morris pulled Aldridge to his feet, securing the handcuffs. You called her that morning, in January 2003, didn't you? Pretended to be someone who could help her prove her case. Asked her to meet you at Hargrove. You have no evidence of that. We have phone records, Sarah said, pulling out another document. A call from a burner phone to Catherine Brennan's home number at 6 a.m. on January 14, 2003. That phone was purchased with a credit card, registered to a shell company owned by Aldridge Properties. Aldridge's face had gone white. That proves nothing. Anyone could have used that card. We also have Carl Vickers' testimony. He saw you at the Route 7 Plaza, watching Catherine. He recognized your car. Sarah stepped closer, her voice hardening. And we have security footage from the hospital, recovered from old backup tapes. You were there, Mr. Aldridge. The day Catherine and Oliver disappeared, you were at Hargrove. The fight went out of him then. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment he looked every one of his 62 years. She wouldn't listen, he said quietly. I offered her money, offered to fund her son's education, offered everything. But she insisted on going public, said the families of those workers deserved to know the truth. So, you killed her, and her son. Aldridge looked up, and Sarah saw something terrible in his eyes. Not remorse, not guilt, just cold pragmatism. I gave them a chance to leave, told them I'd set them up in another state, new identities, enough money to start over. But she refused, said she wouldn't run, wouldn't be silenced like Lydia Marsh. He paused. The boy was unfortunate collateral, but she'd brought him with her. What was I supposed to do? Sarah felt sick. The casual way he spoke about Oliver's death, as if the 7-year-old child had been nothing more than an inconvenience. How did you do it? Vickers helped, though he didn't know what he was helping with. Thought I just wanted to scare her, lock her up for a few hours until she came to her senses. Aldridge's voice was distant now, as if recounting a business transaction. I had keys to the hospital, access to the basement. The room was already there, used for storage. I just had to seal it up afterward. Morris looked like he wanted to hit him. You locked a woman and child in a room and left them to die, to starve to death in the dark. I left them water, food, enough for several days. I thought she'd change her mind, agree to my terms. I checked on them after 48 hours. For the first time, something like emotion crossed his face. She was still defiant, still insisted she'd expose everything. So I left them there. By the time I came back a week later, they were gone. Just quiet. Sarah had to step away, had to breathe, or she would do something she'd regret. The horror of it, the cruelty. Catherine and Oliver had spent days in that room, hope fading with each passing hour. until finally there was nothing left but darkness and silence. "Take him," she said to the uniformed officers. "Get him out of my sight." As they led Aldridge away, he looked back at Sarah. "You'll find them, you know. The others, under the plaza. My grandfather wasn't careful. There are at least 5 bodies there, maybe more. Workers who asked too many questions, who threatened to go to the authorities." He smiled, that same cold smile. "The Aldridge family built this town, built it on secrets and bones. And even now, even with me in handcuffs, this town will protect that legacy. You'll see." When he was gone, Sarah sank into his expensive chair, her hands shaking. Morris stood at the window, looking out at Millbrook spread below them. "We need to excavate the plaza," he said quietly. "Us. Find those bodies. Give them back their names." Sarah nodded. "And we need to tell David Brennan. He deserves to know what happened. All of it." The office felt oppressive now, thick with the weight of secrets finally exposed. For 21 years, Thomas Aldridge had walked free, had lived in luxury built on his family's crimes, while Catherine and Oliver Brennan had mouldered in the darkness, their deaths written off as an unsolved mystery. But mysteries, Sarah thought, had a way of solving themselves eventually. Walls came down, secrets surfaced, and the dead, patient and persistent, waited for justice no matter how long it took. The excavation of the Route 7 shopping plaza began 3 weeks after Thomas Aldridge's arrest. The entire complex was shut down, yellow tape and police barriers surrounding what had once been considered the crown jewel of Harold Aldridge's development empire. Ground-penetrating radar had confirmed what Lydia Marsh had tried to tell the world 66 years ago. There were bodies buried beneath the concrete and steel. Sarah stood at the edge of the excavation site on a cool April morning, watching as forensic teams carefully sifted through layers of earth and debris. They'd found the first body on the second day of digging. By the end of the first week, they'd recovered 6 sets of remains, all male, all showing signs of blunt force trauma to the skull. Construction workers most likely, men who'd seen something they shouldn't have, who'd asked questions Harold Aldridge couldn't allow to be answered. Dr. Voss had identified 3 of them so far through dental records and old missing persons reports. Men who disappeared in 1957 and 1958, whose families had long since given up hope of finding them. Now, finally, they could be laid to rest properly, their names restored, their deaths acknowledged. David Brennan had attended Catherine and Oliver's funeral the week before, a small ceremony attended by neighbors and old friends who'd never stopped wondering what had happened to the bright, kind woman and her sweet-faced son. The bodies had been released after the autopsies confirmed what everyone already knew. They'd died of dehydration and starvation, trapped in that sealed room for approximately 7 to 10 days before death claimed them. Sarah had stood at the back of the church, watching David place flowers on 2 closed caskets, his face carved from grief and something that might have been relief. At least now he knew. At least now he could say goodbye. Bernard Cross had died 2 days after Aldridge's arrest, his fragile heart finally giving out. Eleanor had called Sarah personally to inform her, her voice steady but sad. "I think he was waiting," she'd said. "Waiting to know that the truth had finally come out. He was a weak man, detective, but not entirely a bad one." Sarah wasn't sure she agreed, but she'd murmured something sympathetic. Cross had enabled decades of injustice, had accepted bribes to keep an innocent woman imprisoned, but he'd also kept the evidence that ultimately brought the Aldridge family down. Perhaps that counted for something. Carl Vickers had testified before a grand jury, his statement instrumental in securing Aldridge's indictment on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The old orderly had broken down twice during his testimony, overcome by guilt for his silence, but he'd told everything he knew. The DI had granted him immunity in exchange for his cooperation, a decision that had sat uneasily with Sarah, but was, ultimately, the right call. Vickers had been a coward, but not a murderer. Thomas Aldridge awaited trial in the county jail, denied bail due to flight risk and the severity of charges. His attorneys had mounted an aggressive defense, but the evidence was overwhelming. The phone records, the security footage, Vickers' testimony, and most damning of all, Aldridge's own confession. The trial would be a formality. The Aldridge family's real estate empire had collapsed almost overnight. Investors fled, properties were sold at auction, and the Aldridge name, once synonymous with prosperity and civic pride in Millbrook, became a byword for corruption and murder. The city council had voted unanimously to rename every street, building, and park that bore the family name. Sarah walked across the excavation site to where Dr. Voss was examining the latest discovery, a shallow grave containing 2 more sets of remains. "How many more do you think there are?" she asked. Voss looked up, her face weary. "Hard to say. The radar shows at least 3 more anomalies. Could be more bodies, could be construction debris. We'll know when we dig." Lydia Marsh tried to tell them, Sarah said. For 48 years, she tried to make someone listen. And they labeled her insane for it. Voss stood, removing her gloves. "That's the real horror, isn't it? Not just the murders, but the institutional silencing. The deliberate choice to destroy a woman's life rather than admit the truth." Sarah nodded, thinking of Lydia's letters, her desperate pleas for someone, anyone, to investigate her claims. Thinking of Catherine Brennan, who'd finally listened, who'd believed, and who'd paid the ultimate price for her compassion. A week later, Sarah received a letter from David Brennan. It was brief, written in careful handwriting on simple stationery. "Detective Chen, I wanted to thank you for giving me the truth. It's not the ending I prayed for all those years, but at least now I can sleep without wondering where they are, whether they're suffering, whether they're waiting for me to find them. Catherine and Oliver are at peace now, and somehow, knowing that, I think I might find peace too. Thank you for not giving up on them." David. Sarah kept the letter in her desk drawer, pulling it out sometimes when cases felt hopeless, when the weight of unanswered questions became too heavy. It reminded her why she did this work, why every mystery deserved to be solved, every victim deserved justice, no matter how long it took. The Hargrove Institute was demolished in May, its stone and brick reduced to rubble, its secrets finally exposed to sunlight. The land was purchased by the city and designated as a memorial park, dedicated to all victims of institutional abuse and wrongful imprisonment. Lydia Marsh's name was engraved on a bronze plaque at the entrance, along with Catherine and Oliver Brennan's, and the names of the 6 men found beneath the plaza. On the day of the park's dedication, Sarah stood among a small crowd of survivors and family members, watching as Eleanor Cross, now 94, and walking with a cane, unveiled the memorial. The old woman's face was serene as she read the inscription aloud. "For those who were silenced, may their stories now be heard. For those who were lost, may they now be found. For those who sought truth, may justice finally be served." As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Sarah noticed a figure standing apart from the crowd. An older man with gray hair and tired eyes, David Brennan. He stood before the memorial, one hand resting on his wife's name, his lips moving in a silent conversation only he could hear. Sarah didn't approach him. Some moments were too private, too sacred for intrusion. Instead, she walked back to her car, knowing that while the investigation was closed, the ripples of these crimes would continue to spread through Millbrook for years to come. But the dead had spoken, the walls had come down, and in the end, truth had proven more persistent than any secret, more powerful than any legacy built on lies. The case of Catherine and Oliver Brennan was solved, and somewhere Sarah believed they were finally at rest.